The tropical stillness of Oahu is punctured by the high-pitched whine of Nakajima B-5 N2K torpedo bombers. Below them, the pride of the United States Pacific Fleet, the great battleships West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona, sit like tethered giants in the shimmering blue waters of Pearl Harbor. Within minutes, the air is thick with the acrid stench of burning fuel oil and the deafening roar of explosions that can be felt in the very marrow of one's bones. To the Japanese pilots banking over the smoking ruins, it looks like a total victory. The American naval spine appears snapped. But thousands of miles away, in the quiet, wood-paneled ready rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy's flagship Nagato, the architect of the strike, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, does not celebrate. While his subordinates toast with sake, Yamamoto stares at the reports with a haunting, hollow clarity. He knows the geography of the American spirit better than any of his peers. He had studied at Harvard. He had seen the endless smokestacks of Detroit and the sprawling shipyards of the Atlantic coast. He knew that by sinking the old-world battleships but missing the modern aircraft carriers, he hadn't killed the giant. He had merely bitten it. As the sun sets over a bleeding Hawaii, the clock begins to tick against the Empire Japan, for the sleeping giant has not just woken, it has begun to breathe fire. To understand why Japan gambled its entire future on a single morning in December, one must look not at the flight decks of carriers, but at the dry ledgers of resource management. By 1940, the Empire Japan was a paradox, a military superpower with the feet of a clay pigeon. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Army had been bogged down in the vast, unforgiving expanse of China. The China Incident, as it was euphemistically called in Tokyo, was a quagmire that drained the nation's treasury and, more importantly, its stockpiles of liquid gold, oil. Japan produced less than 10% of the oil it required to maintain a modern mechanical state. The remaining 90% flowed primarily from one source, the United States of America. In the halls of the Imperial Palace and the offices of the Ministry of War, a terrifying realization had taken hold. The Americans were no longer willing to fuel a Japanese war machine that was systematically dismantling the open-door policy in Asia. When Japan moved into northern French Indochina in 1940, Washington tightened screws. By the time Japanese boots hit the ground in southern Indochina in July 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt enacted the ultimate diplomatic weapon, a total embargo on all oil and gas exports to Japan. The clock was now officially running. The Imperial Japanese Navy calculated that without American oil, their fleet would be dead in the water within 2 years. Their industry would grind to a halt within 18 months. Japan faced a binary choice: withdraw from China and abandon its dreams of empire, or strike south toward the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. But there was a massive obstacle standing in the path of the southern advance: the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and the American-controlled Philippines. In the minds of the Strike South faction, led by General Hideki Tojo, war was not a choice, but a biological necessity for the nation's survival. They viewed the United States as a decadent, divided nation, a collection of shopkeepers and jazz listeners who lacked the Yamato spirit, the spiritual indomitability of the Japanese warrior. They believed that a single devastating, decisive battle would shatter American morale, forcing a negotiated peace that would allow Japan to keep its conquests. It was a strategy born of desperation and a profound miscalculation of the American character. While Japanese diplomats in Washington engaged in hollowed-out negotiations, the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, was already training in the secluded, fog-shrouded waters of Haido Kappa Bay. They practiced low-altitude torpedo runs and horizontal bombing, perfecting a surgical strike that would, in theory, buy Japan the time it needed to fortify the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They weren't looking to conquer Washington. They were looking to build a wall of islands so formidable that the Americans would simply lose the will to tear it down. As the final days of November 1941 ticked away, the hull note arrived, a formal American demand that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. To the Japanese High Command, this was an ultimatum that equated to national suicide. The die was cast. The fleet was ordered to move. They sailed under a veil of total radio silence, crossing the North Pacific in the shadow of winter storms, carrier with them the fate of an empire and the fuel for a fire that would eventually consume their own cities. While the tactical planners focused on the coordinates of Battleship Row, a deeper, more dangerous delusion was manifesting in the Japanese War Ministry. They were not merely planning a battle. They were betting against the laws of physics and the sheer mathematics of industrial output. In 1941, the United States possessed a gross national product, GNP, nearly 10 times larger than that of Japan. The U.S. produced 12 times as much steel, 5 times as much coal, and an astounding 700 times the amount of oil. Admiral Yamamoto was one of the few who looked at these numbers and felt a cold shiver of reality. He famously warned the cabinet, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third years." His warning was dismissed as a defeatism of a man too westernized by his time abroad. The prevailing military philosophy in Tokyo, known as Seishin, suggested that Japanese spiritual superiority would overcome any material disadvantage. They believed the American public, pampered by consumerism, would recoil at the sight of high casualty counts and demand an immediate end to hostilities. This fundamental misunderstanding of the American giant extended to the technological and logistical realm. The Japanese viewed their equipment, like the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, as a masterwork of craftsmanship, and the Zero was lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than anything in the American inventory at the start of the war. However, it was built like a fine watch. It was difficult to mass produce and offered almost no protection for its pilot. In contrast, the American industrial machine was designed for the assembly line. While Japan treated its veteran pilots as irreplaceable gods of the air, the United States viewed its pilots as the first wave of a massive, standardized training program. By late 1941, the Two-Ocean Navy Act had already been passed by Congress, authorizing a gargantuan expansion of the fleet. The Japanese knew this. They knew that by 1943, a tidal wave of American ships would begin to slide off the slipways of Kaiser shipyards and Newport News. Their entire strategy, therefore, relied on a knockout blow. They needed to destroy the Pacific Fleet so thoroughly that the United States would be forced to negotiate before its industrial engine could even shift into gear. They were playing a game of poker where they had a strong starting hand, but their opponent had an infinite stack of chips behind the table. On the morning of December 7th, as the first bombs fell, the Japanese were not just attacking a base. They were attempting to freeze time. They needed to stop the future from arriving. But as the USS Arizona vanished into a fireball that claimed over 1,100 lives, the Yamato spirit did not encounter a broken, retreating enemy. Instead, it met something the Japanese leadership hadn't accounted for, a cold, industrial rage. The American public didn't sue for peace. They lined up at recruitment offices. The shopkeepers and jazz listeners the Japanese had mocked were suddenly transformed into a singular, focused workforce. The giant was not just awake. It was already walking toward the factory floor. The most significant failure of the Pearl Harbor attack wasn't what was destroyed, but what was absent. The primary objective of the Kido Butai was the total elimination of the American carrier fleet. However, on that Sunday morning, the USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were nowhere to be found. They were delivering aircraft to distant outposts or undergoing repairs. The Japanese had pulverized the Old Guard, the battleships, which were vestiges of 19th century naval doctrine. In doing so, they inadvertently forced the United States into a modern carrier-based war for which the U.S. was actually better suited. The sinking of the battleships was a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic catastrophe. The Japanese had cleared the deck for the very weapon that would eventually hunt them to extinction. To the Japanese high command, a ship was a sacred vessel of the emperor, often taking years to handcraft. To the American industrialist Henry Kaiser, a ship was a commodity. While Japan struggled to replace even a single lost fleet carrier, American shipyards were beginning to perform industrial miracles. By 1943, the U.S. was launching a Liberty ship every few days and an Essex-class carrier every few months. The Japanese realized too late that they weren't fighting a navy, they were fighting a factory. The sheer scale of American logistics, moving entire floating dry docks and refrigerated, ice cream barges across the Pacific created a psychological weight that Japanese soldiers, surviving on handfuls of rice, could barely comprehend. The Japanese believed their communications were shielded by the complexity of their language and the sophistication of their Type B cipher machine, known to the Americans as Purple. They did not count on the obsessive brilliance of American cryptanalysts like Joseph Rockefeller. Before the Japanese fleet even weighed anchor from Midway in 1942, the Americans were reading their mail. The surprise that Japan relied upon as their primary weapon had been stripped away. This intelligence gap meant that Japan was often fighting a blind war against an enemy that could see through the fog of every operation, turning their decisive battles into carefully laid American ambushes. In April 1942, less than 5 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese public believed their nation was protected by a divine wind and a vast oceanic buffer. That illusion evaporated when 16B, 25 Mitchell bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, rose from the deck of the USS Hornet and appeared over the skies of Tokyo. Tactically, the raid did minor physical damage. Psychologically, it was a seismic shift. The Japanese High Command was humiliated. They had failed to protect the emperor. This pinprick forced Japan into a reactive posture, pushing them to expand their perimeter prematurely at Midway to prevent future raids, a move that led directly to the destruction of their carrier corps. The Japanese military culture relied on the Bushido Code, the idea that death was preferable to dishonor. This created a tier of elite, highly trained pilots and sailors who were almost peerless in 1941. However, this system was brittle. When these veterans died, Japan had no efficient system to replace them, often sending green recruits into battle with barely 100 hours of flight time. Conversely, the U.S. Navy pulled its best pilots off the front lines to teach the next generation. By 1944, the Giant was fielding thousands of well-trained citizen soldiers who were technically proficient and supported by overwhelming technology. The Japanese realized that Spirit could not compensate for a lack of experienced wings in the sky. While Japan focused on superior night vision optics and long-range oxygen torpedoes, the United States poured resources into the invisible eye, radar. By mid-war, American ships could see through tropical squalls in the pitch black of night. Japanese commanders, who prided themselves on their night-fighting prowess, suddenly found themselves being targeted and sunk by unseen enemies miles away. This technological gap meant that even when Japanese sailors fought with legendary bravery, they were often being decimated before they could even sight the American hulls. The realization that American science was outpacing Japanese tradition was perhaps the most sobering waking up of all. By June 1944, the Giant was no longer just awake. It was an unstoppable force of nature. The theater for the ultimate realization was a stretch of the Pacific known as the Philippine Sea. The Japanese High Command, still clinging to the hope of a single decisive battle, Kantai-Kessen, launched Operation A-Go. They committed 9 aircraft carriers and nearly 450 planes in a desperate bid to halt the American advance toward the inner defense ring of the empire. If they could destroy the American fleet here, they believed they could still negotiate a face-saving peace. But the Navy they met was not the wounded animal of 1941. It was the Fifth Fleet, a leviathan of steel and fire. Leading the charge was Task Force 58, a concentration of firepower the world had never seen. The Americans didn't just have more ships. They had evolved. Every American ship was now a bristling fortress of anti-aircraft fire, equipped with the new VD radio proximity fuses, shells that didn't need to hit a plane to destroy it. They only had to get close. As the Japanese strikes approached, they were picked up on American radar screens over 100 miles away. The American response was so efficient, so utterly dominant, that an American pilot famously remarked over the radio, "Hell, this is like an old-time Western turkey shoot." The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the moment the myth of Japanese aerial parody died forever. In a single day, Japan lost nearly 300 aircraft. The Americans lost 30. The Japanese pilots, many of whom were teenagers with only a few weeks of training, were swatted from the sky by seasoned American veterans flying the F-6F Hellcat, a machine designed specifically to outperform the Zero in every metric. By the time the sun set on June 19th, The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The realization began to trickle down from the admirals to the sailors. They were no longer fighting a war of maneuvers. They were being erased by a superior civilization of machines. The giant had brought an industrial assembly line to battlefield, and the Japanese were the raw material being consumed. The true moment of realization was not a single explosion, but a sight that greeted Japanese lookouts as they peered through their high-power binoculars during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had prided itself on having the largest, most powerful battleships in history. The Yamato and the Musashi. These 72,000-ton behemoths were the physical embodiment of the Yamato spirit. Yet, as the Japanese fleet entered the sea beyond sea, they did not find a small, fleeing American force. Instead, they saw a horizon literally crowded with American hulls. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had grown to over 6,000 ships. The Japanese commanders watched in paralyzed awe as waves of American aircraft, not dozens, but hundreds, swarmed their unsinkable giants. The Musashi, a ship Japan believed could withstand any punishment, was struck by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. It didn't fall to a heroic dueling battleship. It was systematically dismantled by an industrial swarm. As the Musashi rolled over and vanished beneath the waves, taking half a crew with her, the psychological backbone of the Japanese Navy snapped. The horror for the Japanese high command intensified when they realized the American logistics were so advanced that they were building artificial harbors and floating supply bases across the Pacific. While Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands were literally starving to death, resorting to eating grass and tree bark, they watched in the jungle as American sailors on ice cream barges enjoyed chilled dairy and fresh bread just offshore. This was a giant, fully upright. It was no longer just about who had the better gun. It was about the fact that the United States could deliver a ton of supplies for every one of its soldiers, while Japan could barely deliver a handful of ammunition. At Leyte Gulf, the Japanese fleet was so low on fuel that their movements were dictated not by strategy, but by the dwindling levels in their oil bunkers. They realized with a crushing finality that they were not just losing a war, they were being deleted by a machine they couldn't even slow down. The decisive battle they had craved for decades had arrived, and it had proven that their entire military philosophy was an antique in a modern world. The realization that conventional victory had become a physical impossibility led the Japanese high command into a dark, psychological corner. By late 1944, the giant was no longer just at the gates. It was over the walls. The Japanese response was a descent into organized madness, the kamikaze. This was the ultimate admission of failure. Japan had run out of planes, fuel, and trained pilots, but they still had the Yamato spirit in its most toxic form. They began to use their remaining aircraft as human-guided missiles, hoping that if they could not outproduce the American machine, they could at least outdie it. Vice Admiral Onishi, the architect of the Special Attack Corps, argued that only through supreme sacrifice could Japan shock the American public into a ceasefire. But even this was a miscalculation. The U.S. Navy responded with the same industrial coldness that had defined their entire war effort. They developed the Big Blue Blanket, a defensive system of interlocking radar, combat air patrols, and a staggering density of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns. The giant simply adjusted its programming. While kamikaze attacks were terrifying and inflicted thousands of casualties, they could not stop the momentum of the American advance. The U.S. industrial machine was now so efficient that a ship damaged by a suicide plane at Okinawa could be repaired in a floating dry dock and returned to the line in days. The Japanese realized that even when they traded a human life for a piece of American steel, the steel could be replaced. The life could not. By early 1945, the maritime blockade of Japan was total. The American submarine fleet, a silent service that had been steadily strangling the home islands, had sunk over 50% of Japan's total merchant marine. Japan was a nation of islands that could no longer reach the sea. The iron, rubber, and oil needed to sustain even a defensive war had stopped arriving. In the factories in Nagoya and Tokyo, machines fell silent because there was no coal to fire the furnaces. The giant had wrapped his hands around the throat of the empire and was slowly, methodically squeezing. By the spring of 1945, the giant reached the final stage of its awakening, the total industrial destruction of the Japanese home islands. The realization of defeat moved from the Admiralty to the average Japanese citizen. It arrived in the form of the B-29 Superfortress. These aircraft were the pinnacle of American engineering, pressurized, high-altitude bombers that Japan had no defense against. Under command of General Curtis LeMay, the U.S. began a campaign of strategic firebombing that targeted the very heart of Japanese production, the decentralized cottage industries, where parts for Zeros and machine guns were manufactured in family homes. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, remains the deadliest air raid in human history. Operation Meeting House saw over 300 B-29s drop incendiary clusters over Tokyo. The resulting firestorm incinerated 16 square miles of the city and killed over 100,000 people in a single night, more than the initial deaths at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. To the Japanese people, the sight of the silver bombers glinting in the sun, untouchable by their own fighters, was the ultimate proof that the giant was not just stronger, but existed on a different technological plane of existence. The final psychological blow came not from the air, but from the sea once again. By July 1945, the U.S. Navy's Third Fleet was cruising openly off the coast of Japan, bombarding industrial cities with 16-inch shells. Admiral William Bull Halsey's fleet was so dominant that it treated the Japanese coastline like a practice range. The Japanese Navy, once the third largest in the world, had been reduced to a few rusted hulls hiding in harbors, unable to even muster the fuel to move. When the atomic clouds eventually rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, they were the terrifying exclamation point on a sentence that had been written years prior in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. The giant had developed a weapon that harnessed the power of the sun itself. The Japanese high command finally accepted the unthinkable, that the Yamato spirit could not fight physics. The surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, a ship named after the president's home state and built in the very yards Yamamoto once feared, was a final, silent acknowledgement that Japan had tried to fight a war against the future, and the future had won. History often remembers wars as a series of tactical maneuvers and heroic charges, but the conflict between the United States and Imperial Japan was, at its core, a clash of two different eras. Japan entered the war with a 19th century mindset of decisive battles and warrior codes, believing that the sheer will of the human spirit could bend the trajectory of steel and fire. They looked at the United States and saw a fractured, soft society. They failed to realize that the giant was not just a military power, but a systemic one. The moment Japan woke the giant, they didn't just invite a fleet into the Pacific. They invited the full, terrifying weight of the modern industrial age. The American victory was won in the shipyards of Richmond, the laboratories of Los Alamos, and the flight schools of Pensacola long before the treaties were signed in Tokyo Bay. It was a war where the assembly line became as lethal as the bayonet, and where the ability to replace a loss became more important than the ability to inflict one. Today, the rust on the sunken hulls of Pearl Harbor and the silence of the island jungles of the Pacific serve as a haunting reminder of this miscalculation. The sleeping giant quote, whether whispered by Yamamoto or synthesized by history, captures a fundamental truth about the nature of power. True strength is not found in the initial strike, but in the capacity to endure, adapt, and outproduce. Japan's realization was a slow, agonizing descent from the heights of tactical brilliance to the depths of industrial exhaustion. It remains one of history's most profound lessons on the dangers of underestimating an opponent's resolve and the cold, hard mathematics of total war. The giant didn't just wake up. It redefined the world in its own image, leaving the era of the samurai and the battleship behind in the smoke of a changing world.